Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Okay, so welcome everyone, and welcome to my co-panelist, Tony. I hope you hear me loud and clear.
Good afternoon, Anders. Yeah, I hear you well. I hope that the audience as well are hearing very well. I would like to thank you for being with me today on the panel. I just want to let me introduce myself, then you can introduce yourself as well. My name is Tony Chebli. I came from the Middle East recently to Belgium. I'm residing in Belgium. I have been in security since 2000. Got a different certificate. I worked on the ISMS. I worked on risk assessment in the Middle East. Now I'm trying to my chances in Europe. So what about you, Anders?
Yeah, so I'm sitting here in sunny Copenhagen. Well, not so sunny, getting pretty cold here up north in Denmark. I also have maybe a background a bit shorter than you. I think for some 18 years I've been affiliated with working with ISO standards, also from a quality perspective, but the last 15 years predominantly on the information security standards, the 27000 series. I've been involved in developing as part of the subcommittees in ISO, developing 27001, 2, so forth. What I do for a living, I train, I consult in how to adopt these different best practices, which you might call them. Yeah, so I think that's a bit about me. Yeah.
Great. So we have a new standard now. Beyond the semantic of the words, what are the changes? What do you think? What are the changes? What are the main changes on the new standard?
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at this, and of course, I'm sharing at the same time, I hope some slides here. I think that walking through those will hopefully give the audience an idea about the most fundamental change, which I guess I could sum up in a sentence saying that there's an alignment with the latest 27001 standard. I think that's the most profound difference that we are seeing now. Of course, you and I, Tony, we will have our ongoing discussions here while we show some and share some slides. And then I think at the end, the PECB will gather any comments from the chat, and we can work on those for an additional 10 minutes. So just to set the scene here, and I hope that's okay. So there are tons of ISO standards dealing with risk assessment in various forms. On top of everything, we might say you have the high-level standards, 1000, some of you may be familiar with, which is of course the one that will adopt for anything, whether it be risk for pollution or food safety. What we're looking at today is of course going a bit deeper and looking at a guidance that's specific on the topic information security, 27005. And I just shown you something else here at the bottom with some legislative reference. That's just to tell you that even within the area of information security, there are detailed standards depicting other elements. These two, in some, relate to privacy. So, but let's focus on 27005. And just to
can I ask a question here before you move forward? Because in every organization today, if we look at the business, because you mentioned that 31000 is all about risk management. You know, in every organization today, they are talking about risk management division, and there is we know that there is a credit, there is operation, and there is now information security. How would you see this complementing each other? How would you put it, since we are talking about alignment?
I think for a lot of organizations, and I could just jump back to this one, there's a strong task ahead of them trying to make this alignment, trying to make sure that once risk reached the table of top management, they're able to translate it into their strategic language. And you might say 27001 just supports one area. Management will have risk assessments coming from quality, from environmental aspects, from service management, and hopefully at the top of it there is some sort of enterprise risk management ideally speaking. I know that small companies will struggle a lot with that, but an enterprise management model that will ensure that information security risks are translated into the language that management understands in order for them to act on it. And that may also explain why we have this variety of risk standard portfolios. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers that part.
To complement what we always ourselves as a security practitioner saying that we align our objective with business objective.
Exactly. This is our and that is exactly, and that is all. That is of course also what the 27001 series, 27000 series is all about, and that is what 27001 should support. The guidance on risk management should support, making sure that we answer in response to objectives that we formulated. And what else? Well, this is of course a standard that should take us through some guidance on how do we assess risk, how do we actually treat them, how do we make sure there's an ongoing monitoring, and how can we communicate internally, externally with relevant stakeholders. So you might say from an actual, in the ideal world where we have a process running, we're operational on information security risk in the sense that we're able to identify once new risk evolve. And that may come from the fact that we are treating new types of information. It may come from a breakdown in the organization. It may come from new technology, or it may come from a new threat perspective. In either one of these cases, we hope that there's a process up and running that will make sure that we identify new risk and that we treat them accordingly. So that's kind of what 27005 should do. Now, I mentioned before, yeah, go ahead.
Can I comment on the previous slide just here?
Yeah, of course.
If you go back one. Because not just, as you mentioned, it's a new threat, a change of value of information and everything, but at the end as well, the process by itself, it might sometimes need to be enhanced. This is as well the continuous improvement.
It's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point that at the point of acting as part of the PCDA cycle, we might have to change our methodology. We might actually have a look at the criteria which we've set for risk assessment, since we seem to have a larger willingness to accept some risk than what we've written down. So yes, indeed, that may also be a consequence of the continuous improvement. It should be.
Great.
Looking into what we hope for 27005 to help us with. Now I'm going back to 27001 and a standard I hope most of you are familiar with, and I'm doing this because obviously 27001 is the requirement standard. It's the one we can get certified against. So most of us come to 27005 to get some help on the requirements from 27001 in relation to risk management. And one of the requirements out of, I'm summing them up to 3, so I'm being a bit, yeah, you might say that I'm doing a bit of lean on them, but one being methodology. We need to document how we go about processing our risk assessment. How's this actually going to pan out? And the reason being that 27001 is not giving us the methodology, so we need a standard to help us on that. And so the hope, of course, is that when we look into a new version of 27005, we get some help on exactly this. How do we build criteria? How do we know what scale to use for probability and consequence? How do we know when to accept risk? What level of willingness do we give? How do we assign risk owners? So the preparational part being summed up in a methodology and explanation of how we go about assessing and treating risk is one thing that 27005 needs to help us with. A second thing is the actual risk assessment. So once we look into 27005, we hope to find some explanation as to how do we find the, let's say, the measurable likeliness of something occurring. How do we know what impact we have, consequence, in order for us to get a value on our risk? That's the second part of what we hope 27005 can help us do in relation to the requirement standard 27001. And the last part, which some of you may know is not entirely fulfilled in the previous version of 27005, namely not just to help us on how we treat risks, but also how we select from a catalog of the most important controls, other things being equal. Of course, I'm reflecting on here, pointing to Annex A in 27001 and the build-up of a statement of applicability. So in sum, we hope that this standard, the guidance standard 27005, can help us on these matters.
I would like to comment here as well, since you mentioned it, because before in the previous version, not all the controls were carried out. We didn't have much to cover, much more. Today, with the new one, I think we don't need to. We should always look for other controls. I'm not saying this is just a baseline from controls, but at least we have more controls in front of us instead of starting with less. And it's up to date because the previous version was a little bit old in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we can look beyond Annex A in 27001. But the thing is, the previous version of 27005 did not really help us in terms of how does risk treatment relate to building a statement of applicability. And so obviously, this is a third point that the new version should help us doing. We've already touched upon this one, Tony, I hope from our discussion right now, but obviously 27001 is a requirement standard. It's not giving us the methodology. So unless you disagree with me, I guess we can't just settle for a requirement standard to help us assess, treat risk, find a methodology.
I would agree on what you say, because at the end, this is just a baseline. Again, I'm repeating myself. And if I use the ISO again, let's say the risk assessment, as we discussed previously, that even if you need to, if you have controls like requirements in PCI or requirements in SWIFT, those risk assessment that we carry on with according to ISO 27005, it's also covered and it's accepted by the auditors, and they are giving us the path for it and the compliance.
Yeah. Of course,
so it's beyond the 27001. It's something that we can use elsewhere as well, not just for 27001.
Yeah, I agree. So, and just now let's dig more into the standard, have a look at what's different. Some of you may say, so why a new standard? Well, of course, the process is that every 5 years, ISO experts get together and say, so do we need to change the standard? Sometimes the answer may be no, we just confirm it. Other times we start building a new standard, and that takes time. And so obviously it will not be just an interval of 5 years every time. So it's been a bit of cat and mouse play here, a bit of 27005 trying to become relevant to the latest version of 27001. So every time there's an update, it's related to matching the requirements of 27001. And now for a long time, we've had a guidance standard here, 27005, that has not been aligned with what we saw in 27001. It's been referring to the 2005 version. So it's really been something that I think the risk security environment have been looking towards. Now, I want just to mention to those of you who are familiar with the fact that there is a new 27001 that just came out recently. And obviously, some of you might fear that, okay, now there's a new 27005, and once again, they're lagging behind. But they're not. For two reasons. The change in 27001 in terms of requirements is no different. It's basically confirmed. It's only the annex as such that has changed. And secondly, the work on 27005 was also done with eyes focused narrowly on what happened at the development of 27001. So it is indeed adjusted to both the, you might say, 2013 and the 2022 version. And like I said at the beginning, the most fundamental change that you will see in the new guidance is that it's a close alignment to the latest 27001 version. What does that actually mean? Well, if you look into the standard structure of 27005, it's no different overall speaking. you look into it, you still see the old model, which I've depicted here, something where you start with a preparational level at establishing context. That's where you build your methodology. That's where you find out who does what, when, and how. And then you have the risk assessment. So this is actually depicting exactly what you would find in the generic standard, which we talked about at the beginning, 31,000. Now, so where are the changes? Where are the changes? Well, the changes are actually in each of these chapters, because when you look into establishing context for one, you would see that the preparational phase that's usually explained in here has a very clear tie now to the chapter in 27,001 dealing with organizational context, business requirements, stakeholder needs and expectations, legislational requirements. So it's actually making direct references to 27,001. I think we've gone from 10 references to 27,001 to more than 100. So it's really something that is manifest in the standards. When we look in, go ahead.
I think what you're saying is it was before releasing this version, it was like interpretation. It depends on the consultant who's doing this, because at the end he was looking at all of those things that you're mentioning, but because the update of the standard changed a lot of things. So now it's making clear, I would say clear for anyone who wants to work with it. Before, if you don't have the expertise on doing those requirements, as you mentioned, take the older version. If you don't have the expertise, you cannot reach what you're saying, because as you mentioned, each and every process in that, there is details on that, and we know that Satan lies in those details. So we missed something.
I think you do. And of course, for people trying to implement an ISMS according to 27,001, you had a standard where you weren't really sure, where are they now? Where are they at? And there's another point which is really important to emphasize. When you got into the risk assessment, which is depicted by 3 elements, 3 phases, you might say, identification, analysis, and evaluation, there was a strong focus on threats, vulnerabilities, and assets. And not to say that's not relevant, but looking into the requirement standard, there was not a word on threats. There was not much on assets. You would need to go to the annex to find that. So there wasn't really a coherent guidance. And that's changed entirely. So now the references on identification, which you might say is a phase where you figure out what might happen, and the analysis phase, which is where you put a number on your probability and your consequence to measure risk, and the evaluation, which is where you take the numbers you found and put them against your risk acceptance. Now there's a clear alignment to the explanations or the requirements you have in 27,001. But one thing being really different here, and I think that's important to stress out, there's an opening now for 2 models. We're going to talk a bit more about that, but there's an opening for going about looking still at assets, a more operational approach to finding risk scenarios, looking at how threat origins might attack, find vulnerabilities to exploit, leading to damage to the loss of confidentiality, of course, availability, integrity, and hence a consequence for information security. And another approach, the event-based, is explained, one that works from a strategic level, building scenarios that probably stem from risk owners, management saying this is something that will kill the business, and then working your way down to probability. So 2 different approaches are now being presented in the risk identification, which is of course entirely new. And I would also say there's also something new on risk treatment, but we'll get to that later. We've already touched upon it. But the structure as such.
Since you mentioned this, I would say that the event, let's say the scenario 1 would be a top-down approach, and the other one would be bottom-up. But
fully agree.
If we look at it from a business perspective now, which one is better? That's because I've seen someone saying that they are in contrast. I don't think this is true, because they complement each other for me. And sometimes you need to go from top-down approach because you don't have time. You need now imminent thing to deal with. Sometimes it's good to, as you mentioned, operation, and take the whole details, evaluate everything, and find every detail. They complement. They are not in contrast as many IT folks are saying. No, I would say they are complementary. And from a business perspective, it's more relevant today because we can show the business. Because again, I'm getting back to the first topic that I mentioned. We align ourselves with business, So if we want to align ourselves with business, this is how we show them what are the differences.
I fully agree. I fully agree. And so the idea, and as I will show on one of the slides going forward, there is indeed I should not say overlapping, but on what you said, you're actually on par, because they fully complement each other, and we need both perspectives, I think. So just taking the vertical risk assessment model that you saw, so the greenish part you have here, and tilting it into a horizontal model. So the risk assessment approach is still the same that you know, but then again, now we need to reflect on the fact that the standard will show us you can go asset-based, you can go event-based. Either way, you look at scenarios in the identification phase, figure out what might happen to us. You may look at threats and vulnerabilities. You may look at the concerns of the business owners. You then work to bring on analysis. That means putting numbers on probability. I'm using a scale here, 1 to 4. It might be a 1 to 100 or 1 to 3. That all depends. But you put numbers on your probability and consequence in the analysis phase, and then in the evaluation phase, you may have a heat chart, which I depict here, and where you say, okay, the numbers we found, what do they actually mean to us? And that's where you bring in the risk criteria from the context establishment that was at the top of the process. So this is actually still same, but very different from the perspective that you now have two models that are at play here in the standard. I also want to say that there are more examples along the way. So the standard will go more onto a track where it says, if you're a company like this, you may want to adopt a process that looks like this. So I think you get a more practical angle to the 27005 standard now than what you've seen in the past. Tony said that I actually believe the event-based and asset-based approach complement each other. I'm just taking an illustration here. I'm not 100% sure it ended up in the standard. I have another one that's definitely there, but just to show that the event-based approach works from business concerns, not from technical experts, but it works from the ones who say, what would the business be able to maybe even survive? What have we experienced in the past? What are our biggest concerns? And of course, it ties into what the asset-based approach is more narrowly linked into, namely likelihood or probability, looking at assets, how they exploit vulnerabilities, and then attack our business from an asset-based approach. I think I have another one here which more clearly shows how they complement each other. So the standard now also in a separate annex works on these different models on how we, with an event-based approach, build scenarios from a strategic perspective, and at the asset-based approach, go more operational on how we see on how we see risk. And of course, both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. The strength, of course, being for the event-based approach that you get a good picture of what will have consequence for the business, and at the asset-based level, you look more at likeliness, probability, working with assets, threats, vulnerabilities.
I have a question here, since you mentioned here, if we, for the sake of getting the certification of the ISMS, do we have to do both for risk assessment approach, or no, we settle for one? Because you know, on the ISMS, we need to put the assets, classify, and this. So if I want to take, looking from that perspective, just for the certification sake, can I do just can I use the scenario event and that's it? I can get the certification.
I think it's a really good question, but I think that the answer is that it's very hard to I mean maybe this the slide I'm presenting now, which I think is one that shows risk perspective on this. So I'm going to explain this one, and hopefully I answer your question, because usually the endeavor of building good information security risk assessments comes from the fact that we have users and business owners understanding what they need and what they fear might happen to their assets, to their organization as such. And we work from the fact that we need to identify, of course, concerns to, are we losing availability? Are we losing integrity? Are we losing confidentiality? In order for top management to understand what we're talking about, we need to translate these elements of CIA into something more tangible. Are people losing lives? Are we getting fined? Are we losing our operational capacity. We cannot sell anything on the internet anymore. So that's going to the strategic level. On the other hand, in order for us to understand the likeliness, for instance, of a software update going wrong, we need to engage with the more operational level. We need to understand in how likely would that even be to happen. And that's where we go, for instance, just as an example, it could have been facility, but we go to an IT department and make them help us understand interdependencies on our systems, applications, in order for them to help us qualify elements within our risk assessment. So I think both elements would need to be at play in most organizations in order to fully have a risk assessment with value. But it's important to stress, of course, whether you go asset-based or event-based, you look at likeliness, you look at consequence.
That's true, yeah. Because I was wondering when you just show now this picture that for the sake of getting the certification, it's clear for if you want to manage properly your business, let's say your risk management, you need to do both. And of course, is what I'm trying to see it.
Yeah, and also because 27001 has built in an NXA with measures, controls, now 93 controls that you need to take into account. And a lot of them are, of course, they lead to a more technical path. And for you to say they're not applicable would, of course, instantly lead to a qualified auditor saying, okay, I want to look at your risk assessment. Let me understand why the classic risk scenarios do not apply to you. And then we will get down to an operational level where there will be non-conformities, you might say, right?
Yeah. So in summary, if you want to say, not for the sake of getting the certification, but if you want to have a high-level top-down approach, you can do the risk assessment based on scenario-based, event-based, let's say, just to have an idea, especially if you want to do business continuity, because this is where it's more, you can see it clearer for it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And of course, you can work from either model as long as which you will, of course, you put in a value on your probability and your consequence. I see a lot of organizations, being most comfortable with working with risk scenarios from the more event-based approach, but I also see others digging into each and every asset in some areas in order for them to feel absolutely confident that they have depicted every way an attacker might get in. And again, I guess I'm saying that they complement each other in a lot of ways.
True.
Yeah. Okay. What else? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think we covered many things about the event and the scenario based, the asset and the event based.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the treatment, again, as we know that things are moving, it was faster actually on the other side. I have seen a different approach on the risk assessment from other, let's say, perspective. Now it's up to date. We can see that modify, avoid, or accept or share. This has been used even before releasing the new release, which is good. And
and I think
it's documented.
Yeah, and I think this one is actually not in the current version. There's not much change here. These are the options. Someone likes to call share transfer. It doesn't really matter. Transfer is an element within A, depicted here as an option. We can outsource. We can use insurance. Whether you call it transfer or share, it doesn't. To my ears, it doesn't matter that much. You might say the transfer part is an element within sharing risk. Then we have risk, of course, risk retention, acceptance. So we might want to live with a risk just because it's low, or simply from the fact that we can't do anything else. Or we might.
The cost is higher. Or the cost is higher.
Exactly. We might say from a business cost-benefit interpretation, we accept. We might, in some instances, avoid. Now, there might be a pandemic, and suddenly things are closed down, and we have an avoidance strategy in place. There might be sanctions to a country, not mentioning anyone, and that may lead to an avoid as well, an avoid practice. And then, of course, at the option D, we do something about risk.
About the avoid, because I have been working on credit cards, we had some problems coming from certain countries we don't mention. So we had all the time we had fraud. So the decision of the business was, okay, stop accepting the cards from that, even if it's we're getting money from them, because it was very high. So Avoid,
would be
sometimes it's a decision. Sometimes you have to do it from, again, I'm talking from a business perspective always.
Exactly, and often it's a very expensive choice. But again, we look at the business and we say this is something we cannot live with. Avoidance strategy is also something that might come out of the fact that we are planning to treat personal identifiable information in a certain way, and we realize there are risks tied to this new process, and we can't really do anything about it. We can't really find a set of controls that will help us bring down the risk to a level that is acceptable. Hence, we find another way of running the process. That would be an avoidance strategy as well. And of course, modify, I think it's important to say, to notice that there is a change in the term of risk. Sorry, there is not risk, we'll get back to that, but there is a change in the interpretation of a control. Control being something that could, usually it's about something that modifies risk. I think that's the definition, it modifies risk. And now it's being changed into risk being something that either modifies or maintains a risk. Hence, you may have a changed threat environment, which means that you build controls, and even though you add new controls, you're not really changing the risk. You're just maintaining it. So, well, anyway, so maintain, modify. This is where we put in controls in option D. This is, overall speaking, this has not changed. What has changed to the standard is what I mentioned before, that the risk treatment chapter now in 27005 is explaining how our risk assessment and the risk treatment options have an interplay with the selection of relevant controls in the Annex A of 27001. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that the annex has now changed. It's not 14 domains. We're just looking at the time here. We're good. It's 4 themes now that we are working from, 4 chapters depicting organizational, people-related, physical, technological controls. Now, 27001 has been neatly formulated in the way that it does not go into detail on this. That's where we would use the control guidance standard 27002, but it does explain how we build a statement of applicability, how we ensure that we are not omitting any necessary controls.
Just to here open again, a small bracket for everyone to understand that the controls which is in the 27002 or the Annex A is just the let's say the baseline. It's not exhaustive, so you might get more than this. Yes. Many times when I'm doing consultancy, sometimes they say, okay, we covered everything in the Annex A. Why do we need to get more? Again, we are talking about risk assessment. If you feel there is a problem, you need to deal with it, or you accept it, as you mentioned, with the options. So no, you need to put it on the table and specify it. And if the management decides it's too expensive, or no, it's not, we don't want to bother, or we don't want to invest, that's fine. But at least you put it on the table instead of not to have problems later on with the management on this.
Definitely. And I also want to say that, so I fully agree that you may want to say, well, we are also working with NIST 800-53, for instance. We may be working with other sector-specific frameworks that we need to adopt. And of course, the only reason why we have Annex A is to make sure that we're not forgetting what is usually very important controls. And for other organizations, it may go the other way, that we need to remember, it's like you said, it's our risk profile that determines this. And then we may actually decide not to have some of the controls. And I think sometimes, and I hope the guidance text here in the new 27005 will help organizations to understand the interplay between risk assessment, risk treatment plans, and the statement of applicability, because sometimes they don't seem to respond to each other. The dialectic element that should be there is lacking. So hopefully it will get there. Yeah. This is very difficult to see what I've done here, because there should be a bit of coloring on some of the elements here. I know it's really small letters here, but let me just explain what I want to say something about here. There is an entirely new element, another new element in the standard, which is a separate chapter that is titled Leveraging Related ISMS Processes. And what this does is to go beyond just the risk assessment and risk treatment and more thoroughly explain how the different requirements in 27001 relate to risk assessments, risk treatment. So what I've depicted here are the requirements chapters in 27001. And what I've tried to do with a bit of coloring, and I think I failed fully, but bear with me, is to try to explain what this chapter does. So it reflects on how the organizational context at chapter 4 and the stakeholder expectation and needs fuel into the later risk assessment. It also explains how leadership management has a role in, of course, allocating resources, accepting risk, communicating risk. We're on to support chapter as well. What communication needs to be there? How do we ensure that risk owners often at the higher level of business understand what they own as a risk? How do they even play ball with us at a risk assessment level? And of course, what needs to be documented? So now we are still in the support chapter 7.5. What needs to be documented when you do risk assessment? And when you evaluate, how does risk interplay on monitoring? What is at play when we look at non-conformities in the improvement level? So an entirely new chapter that shows us how risk play an important role, not just around planning and operation, but also in other processes which are required by the ISMS requirement standard 27001.
In other words, Anders, you're saying that the security is the responsibility of each and every person, and the management is the first one to be engaged.
Yeah. What I think we're gaining of value here from this chapter is an understanding of how risk plays an important part in almost each one of the requirements in the ISMS. And here it's explained how does it fuel into the risk assessment, how does it reflect in the monitoring. I mean, the fact that we build KPIs here, KPIs on what came from the risk treatment, what controls are we monitoring. So this interplay is more thoroughly explained in clause 10.
That's why we are broadcasting, saying everyone should have a risk management division in the organization to manage everything, because you cannot take each process alone. It's not just information, it's everything.
No. And of course, for organizations, some of them will definitely be here on the call that work with different management standards. You all know how value is created by integrating different standards, different management systems, and of course, working with, say, internal audits. Risk is, of course, an important element. The risk-based assessment is absolutely vital when you go about and assess against specific criteria on both quality and corporate social responsibility and environmental controls as such. So we get this information on how risk is at play in different processes in 27001, not just building assessment and treatment. Yeah, and of course I think we've of course talked about this. Is there too much emphasis on an ISMS now that we have 27001, as a reference more than 100 times in the standard now? Is that too much? From my point of view, I think it's absolutely critical that we now have a guidance text that is more on par with what we work with. Understanding the requirements of 27001 needs for us to requires for us to have some place where we can go and understand risks more fully in various processes. And I think the update here helps us a lot on that. So I'm from my perspective, I'm really happy on the emphasis. I think this is what 27005 is all about, helping us get to a valuable, efficient ISMS.
Yeah, this is where I think, again, we're emphasizing that the management here start to be engaged, because in the previous days, if you say who's responsible for security, they point to the security and to IT, and whatever happens, it's always them to be blamed. Today, no longer. It's no longer accepted those two to be hanged every time there is a problem. So that's why I think the emphasis on risk is becoming much more. So we need to invoke, yes, the management. They should understand what it's all about, what are the risks, not to blame every time the IT or the security for something they don't have control on it. Just to give an example, many times we asked for a budget and they say no. Why no? Because no, just that's it. And something goes wrong. You didn't emphasize much on us. That's why it's your problem. No, we did speak a lot. I think this is again why I think it's what we mentioned, too much emphasis on risk in an ISMS. So that's why people now, I think the standard, who wrote the standard knows that we need to translate this into, yeah, it's the management responsibility.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of things, I mean, the winds have really been blowing for the last 5 to 8 years, helping top management get involved. Now they understand why it's important. The next step for some organizations is for top management to understand what does that mean for their role? What questions should they ask, right? So there's still work to be done, but I think from some really dark negative cases in the press, companies almost closing down because of a ransomware attack, legislation, the GDPR in Europe, of course, a very important element in helping or getting top management involved. Sometimes a couple of high fines might help on that one, but of course, we want them to be there for not just the fines, but for the right reasons. A lot of organizations are now realizing that, well, cybersecurity, information security is, of course, top-level growth capability. Another small change I think I want to mention is that coming from the 2018 version to the new one, there's a gathering of all the annexes and also a broadening of, you might say, of the scope here. We dig deeper into different risk techniques. This is where the standard maybe starts to look a bit more like what's in the IEC standard 31010, where you get more practical techniques. What you can see from these annex headers is that there's a more thorough explanation of the event and asset-based approach, but there's also something else hidden in these annexes that I think is worth mentioning, namely an outline of what it would mean to work from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. So both quantitative models and qualitative models are now placed in the standard. One I've of course expressed here with some logarithmic examples on probability, and another one, the more, let's say, semi-qualitative approach being shown. So some organizations may coming from the finance sector may say, oh, finally, there it is, that's what we all love. And others may say, oh, we're more familiar and more confident that the people conducting risk assessment are able to work with a more qualitative approach, being referring to their level of expertise, competencies, the ability to collect the data necessary. That kind of leads them in a more qualitative direction. What do you think on this, Tony? Working quantitatively, qualitatively, does it give merit that the standard now has both approaches mentioned? More fully?
Before releasing this version, I was doing it always. I've done it, I'd say, on a personal level, because I needed to translate things to the management. So now with having this documented, it will make things more simplified and it's more guided. So it's good to have. Sometimes you cannot, if you don't have numbers, you cannot have quantitative.
No.
So if there is no numbers, how can I tell how much it costs? However, if I have those costs, no, let's go for quantitative and give the numbers. This is how much you're going to lose. ALE, annual loss expectancy and single loss expectancy. So those, when the management understands those, they say, okay, no, let's invest, or no, let's accept it. So sometimes you don't have the luxury. Sometimes you do have, and if you have it, I would do it both actually.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, working with a lot of organizations, I think the main issue is that when looking at the people who are supposed to conduct risk assessment, you just don't have the qualifications to bring on a quantitative model. That's what I see in most places, most sectors, right? And so you still work from numbers, but you work from the qualitative text part, right? Saying a scale, I mentioned 1 to 4, for instance, right? And so the qualitative element is, of course, the one that is highlighted. But again, this one would still need to be tied to elements such as business loss. I mentioned fines. It could even be a cost of pollution, cost of lives as such. You would need some sort of quantitative element to get your management fully up to speed with what you're talking about. Yeah. So I think it's important to depict both of the models. Of course, in the financial sector, the quantitative ones are already fully embedded for risk assessments in terms of information, cybersecurity. it's still a tough road ahead, I think.
It is actually, it's before performing if it's quantitative or qualitative, if you don't have people who has the know-how and the capacity to do a risk assessment, that's another problem. Okay, they can follow, they can have an Excel sheet, you can get an Excel sheet and everybody just punch in the numbers. But what will be the outcome? That's another problem that we face every time. No, you need someone who has an expertise. Especially, again, I'm repeating myself because what we are doing is to align ourselves with business. If we don't understand the business, how we can tell what are the problems? It will be just numbers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can, and you can go about doing both things, but it's difficult. And of course, the challenges I see with the quantitative one where I work is that people have difficulty understanding what exactly are the likeliness for something to happen annually. How much will actually be damaged when that happens? They just don't have the data at hand. What are the data even worth? They haven't set those scores. And so it becomes really difficult to for instance, engage in an annual loss expectancy model if you don't have any of those numbers present.
That's true. That's true. And if we talk the qualitative, just to open a bracket here, once I was doing a risk assessment, I asked, did you encounter any, let's say, virus outbreak? He said no. Okay. All right, we expect that. So he doesn't have any control in place.
No, so if you haven't had the historical evidence of it, it should still be depicted, right? So that's of course another problem. Just because we're closing up here, I just wanted to say that for other standards within the ISO 27 series, terms are now included. So usually you would have to go to the 27,000 standard, the one that's just 27,000, right? And get the terms explained. But now they're included in the standard. And that means, for instance, that you can get a lot of information on risk. I might have some issues with the fact that you have a lot of different risk definitions now in the notes, which can sometimes make it difficult to understand whether risk defined from an information security perspective are just neutral or a negative one. So, but anyway, the terms that are being used in a standard are present, and I think that's overall a very valuable element that we've had those included. I also want to mention another change, which is the fact that once we get into the risk assessment process, the one I depicted, there's always been an input, and then what is the action, and what output, what comes out of the process. And now there's also another element which I've shown here in the middle, which is called trigger. Provide some guidance on when to start an activity, for example, due to a change in an organization or according to a plan. So a new trigger element as part of the entire process.
Hopefully it's not a breach.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we're getting to the point, of course, where we would perhaps sum up a bit of what we've talked about. So from my point of view, this has become a more practical standard and much easily used in connection with 27001. No doubt about it. I think it's valuable that we now see some explanation on whether you're at an operational or strategic level in how you identify risk, for instance, with the asset and event-based approach. And of course, a more specific guidance on risk management with examples, and the annex, which is now depicting also a quantitative model. Of course, some of you are familiar with the previous version may fear that the catalog with with threats and vulnerabilities are gone. It's not. It's still there. So you still get the understanding also of threat motivation and capability still available there, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. So I think that kind of sums it up for us. We're maybe even 1 minute ahead of our time, but I'm sure we will use that on other questions or comments that have come from the chat.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, Tony.
I just want to conclude that yes, the standard is getting us more closer to the business side, this is a new release. I would invite everyone to take advantage of it because instead of being a technical person who's put in the corner every time, now it's time to use that standard and push it closer to the business and say, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, thank you, Anders and Tony, for delivering this very informative webinar. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and take some time to just answer some of the questions from the attendees. Okay, the first question is, can you give some examples on how the new ISO 27005 supports the creation, maintenance of the statements of applicability?
Yeah, so I think it's best. I mean, the guidance text that's now depicted. The main difference is that you now have a smaller chapter within risk treatment that explains the importance and the process at which stages you need to familiarize yourself with NXA in order to build the statement of applicability. It's not understood in the way that you get an Excel sheet on what columns need to be there. So it's more of aligning your risk assessment with when you need to engage with NXA and when you need to build the statement of applicability. I think that's important to stress. So there's not a sample as such within the risk assessment. But of course, the important difference is that previously there wasn't really a mentioning of when and how do you engage with NXA in order to build the SOA document.
On a personal level, each one of us who has the expertise, actually. Now it's just mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, another question is, can you give example of event-based risk for cloud workloads?
For cloud?
Yeah, cloud workloads.
Cloud workflows. That's a very specific question. I think I would, in order to get these specific examples, I think I would maybe point the question in the direction of the cloud-related standards in the 21 series, which will of course reflect also on controls that tie to cloud-based risks. As such, the standard does not fully go into that, unless Tony, you want to share your examples.
I would do it on event-based, like business continuity. You know, when you try to get something on the cloud, you do an assessment before choosing that vendor. So yeah, you start doing your scenarios based on whatever you have as a service. Because as you mentioned, Anders, I don't have everything in front of me, but I would do it one by one, step by step. So I will do the events. What can be done? So I will ask those questions to the vendor, and I do those events based on what he's offering me. For instance, let's say he's saying that I'm offering you a disk space. Okay, what happens if this is not happen? It's not there. So what shall I do? So those are very dependent on things. But yeah, once you get those services, you try to do events based on them.
Yeah, and I might also want to, I mean, just to share my thoughts on this. I mean, when you work with an event-based approach, you would of course tie it to your business. If you sell something on the internet, the fact that you have a web server that's not available, that would tie from the event-based approach saying we're losing our business portal down to saying that ties to a cloud supplier not having updated their systems or a breakdown crisis at their side. So you would come from a business element and then you would drill your way down to looking at the systems, the assets tied to a cloud environment. Yeah, it's on top of my head for an example, right? But I think there are other standards that will give you a better list of what you need here.
Actually, here you need to combine both the event and the asset base in order to get a clearer picture on this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anders and Tony. Okay, the next question is, can you explain the difference in approach between process-based risk like threat modeling on application versus event-based?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm not on the modeling part. The first one, I'm not I'm not a strong role. So I would say no, I cannot. Instead of me just babbling, but yeah, so I cannot answer that question. Yeah.
Actually, he's trying to compare with the Stride. If you take the Microsoft, which is you have different levels, it's a different. This is from a technical perspective more than a scenario based, where you have different levels. What will happen? I would say they are not similar, but sometimes they converge in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, just to maybe make a comment on value to this, what you get from the standard is an overall idea about what the asset-based approach looks like. When you have an overview of your entire portfolio asset, whether being primary or supportive assets, you look at them and you look at, of course, at what could be the reason of something unwanted to happen, namely threats that will exploit your vulnerabilities. And looking at that, it's still from an overall perspective, you will still want to engage in maybe a vendor-specific model coming from Microsoft or elsewhere in order to explain how this is done. And I think that's maybe where the application-related suggestion came from as well.
Thank you, Anders. Antonio. Okay, the other question is any resources on how to go about doing risk assessment?
Well,
any resources? I mean, please pose the question again.
Maybe.
Yeah, make suggestions. Yeah, okay. Well, one thing, of course, it all depends on what we're talking about. But I think there is, from my perspective, working with companies of larger and smaller size, starting to engage in risk assessment for information security, the first question that's being posed should be in a group of users and business responsible people saying, what do we fear the most? What makes us unable to sleep at night? What are our biggest concerns? What has hit us before that had business impact? So from that, we build the first scenarios. So we start from what you might say is more of an event-based approach. Then we look at some of the scenarios we find, and some of them may require us for drilling deeper down to the technical elements. Us, for instance, understanding whether a system that is of our concern will go down because we've seen it before. Well, we'll have to engage with the operational technical levels in order for them to help us assess probability. So again, we're drilling down to probability in some cases. But instead of working from what I would bring in a second round would be a threat register in order for us to make sure that we haven't omitted something that is usually business practice wise relevant to look into. But I wouldn't start there. I would start with what the business has experienced, has familiarized itself with, that what is unique to the business. That's where I would start the risk assessment.
I would go to the context, actually look at the business side, understand the business more, do some research about the business. What are the risks from other companies? So this is how I used to do it. Just to give an example, once I was doing a risk assessment for an oil refinery, which is beyond me, I never dealt with the oil and refinery. I did some studies, I did some research. I went to consultants who knows about oil refinery, so they gave me hints about what can go wrong. So from there, I did collect those info and use them during my risk assessment.
Yeah, and also to support this, right? So when I'm suggesting maybe a workshop-based initial phase, it should still be supported by someone who can give examples in order to get people talking, of course. But important mentioned from Tony, of course, we're doing this because we have some objectives for the business. There's something we want to achieve. And so, of course, risk assessment should originate from those objectives. If we're making a risk assessment on a system that's irrelevant to the business, we're starting in the wrong area. That's for sure.
Thank you. Okay, and the last question for today's session is ISO 27005 2011 version has sections for identification of assets, threats, vulnerabilities, existing controls, and finally consequences. Has this approach been changed in 2022 version?
No, you still have the catalogs on threats and assets and so forth. It's been collected into one annex, you might say, but you still have that inspirational level, you might say, of what threats could happen, what kind of vulnerabilities tie into those threats, what are assets. Some of it has been a bit more, you might say, been compiled a bit more in order also to give room to the event and asset-based approach, but it's still there.
Okay. Thank you one more time, Anders and Tony, for joining us today in this webinar. Just an information to the audience: be informed that this session is recorded and it will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thanks a lot one more time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.